The stars tonight, the lights are so bright.
Hello and welcome to my very first episode of Diaries of a Game Coder. My name is Alex Erath, and after about 30 years of game development, I decided to share my stories, good or bad, with all of you to enjoy. So let's get started. Long before I even made video games, I was born and raised in Germany, and growing up at the tender age of 12 years old, I was presented with my very first home computer, the TI-99 4A. Always having been fascinated and playing video games, I was curious how video games are actually being made. And so I set out and coded as much as I could on my TI-99 4A, but my path was set. I was determined to become a video game programmer. Once I turned 14, I got a Commodore 64 computer, which was really my very first computer that kind of blew the doors wide open for me to become a video game coder. Commodore 64 had the notion of sprites, which was a big thing for any of the 2D consoles that would come out later on. It had access to machine language. Back then, there was a lot of peeking and poking going on, where you would enter hexadecimal values in long listings to generate machine code that would then translate into a video game or a graphics demo, what have you. It was a very fun machine though. We had a few decent, so to speak, assemblers for it available, and that kind of really got my feet wet into what it takes to make a video game. While the TI-99 4A got a lot of the simple concepts down, it also had hardware sprites, but it was predominantly programmed in BASIC. The Commodore 64 allowed me to access the machine assembly language, and graphics were also a little better on the Commodore 64, at least when it came to colors. And so I really kind of broadened my programming spectrum, diving deep into assembly language and seeing what other people did. And that really kind of made me understand how video games actually worked and how they would be programmed and what I could expect later on. After the Commodore 64, I should say a friend of mine got an IBM, it was an actual IBM PC XT computer. We turned it on and it came with a green screen, and it was like, oh wow, look, there's a blinking cursor. It almost feels like war games or something. It was pretty crazy. We're like, whoa, this is like a real machine. So somehow in our mind we thought it was like infinitely more powerful than the Commodore 64 or the TI-99 4A or even obviously the Spectrum and whatnot, whatever computers they had back then. But all we had was like the green blinking cursor, and it was kind of like, okay, now what do we do? So we learned DOS and entered some DOS commands. It's like, oh look, this looks like a real computer. But then it came to games, and apart from the green monitor, later on they came out with a CGA card which had like a whopping 4 colors or so, and 320 by, it was 320 by 200 or 320 by 240 resolution. It's really shitty compared to the Commodore 64. And that was always kind of puzzling to me. Why is a computer that's so powerful so much more inferior when it comes to games to like the Commodore 64 and their likes? But then at some point I dove into assembly language on the IBM PC, especially once I got my own PC clone. It kind of occurred to me that it had none of this support hardware for sprites that was specifically driven towards games, because this was a business computer, so to speak. So while they had a lot of neat applications that would let you do spreadsheets and word processing and whatnot, the one thing that was missing was games. And whatever games were out there were mostly games that would lend themselves towards more storage space, which would translate into larger games. So you could have like adventure, more static, but more content games, such as adventure games, things of that nature. But like hardcore arcade games were still reserved for the Commodore 64 and then later on the Amiga, which I never had the joy to own one back in the day. I decided to go the IBM PC route. And I don't really regret it. I did okay with the IBM PC. Later on they would release an EGA card with 640 by 480 resolution, something like that. And then they came out with a VGA card, which again, that kind of blew the doors wide open for me. The CPUs were getting a little bit faster, and they had this MCGA mode, which was 256 colors at the same time, but again at a resolution of, I think it was 320 by 240 or so. But with all the colors available, you could do some form of smoothing, which is kind of a trickery to make the image appear as if it was higher resolution. And that kind of really blew me away, to see that many colors on the screen at the same time. It was kind of like, to me it felt like, okay, finally the IBM PC is kind of like the Commodore Amiga, like it was a few years before. But it's okay, we're catching up. IBM PC is alright. And then I fondly remember coding some graphic demos to kind of show off the colors, and I would use algorithms to draw bands of slightly changing colors to get the illusion of kind of like psychedelic, if you will, graphics. They looked cool, they looked impressive because they would show off the colors of the machine and whatnot, but they were fairly simple demos, but it was kind of fun. I did that to show IBM computers in our storefront at a computer store that I worked on at the time, back in Germany. So that was a lot of fun. That kind of got me the entry into the IBM PC, got me into eventually C compilers and much more complex programming paradigms than were able at the time on the Commodore 64 without jumping through hoops, and I was pretty much set. I continued my path, my quest, if you will, to become a video game coder, and had a lot of fun doing that. So while I was honing my coding skills on the IBM PC, I would also go to college after I got my high school degree in electronic engineering in Germany. And well, let's see it. I took one semester, and then I went to California on vacation. I came back to Germany, and unfortunately it was too late for me to register for the next semester, because vacation took a little too long. But anywho, so my plan was, I'll just drop one semester, go work at the computer store, and then pick it up the semester after. Well, for some reason, I got this letter in the mail that said, hey, you're not going to college, you must join the military. I was like, okay, let me see. I already have my green card. Should I go join the military or go to California? Let me think. Okay, California. So boom, I left. And then once I arrived in California, I was like, okay, this college thing. Yeah, I kind of need to make money, so maybe I need to find a job. So, what better job than well, actually, at first, I did like 1 week of telemarketing or so. After selling nothing, because my English was so bad, I kind of decided, yeah, maybe telemarketing is not for me, but I needed money. So I ended up starting to work at a computer store, since I had a lot of experience in how to put computers together. Did that for a while, and then, well, a while being a few months, and then one of our customers hired me away to become a software engineer. I was like, oh, cool. So I started picking up Ada. Now, Ada is an older coding or programming language that the government used because it was ahead of its time. And unfortunately, it was ahead of its time because the computers were too slow to run anything at any kind of speed. So video games, for sure, no. Even the code that my then boss wrote ran dog slow, but it was required by the government. So I was like, okay, why don't you give me all your source code and let me take a look at it and I'll see what I can do. So I took the whole thing, rewrote it in assembly, and just had the program, just had the entry points in Ada, so you would be calling assembly from Ada, and gave it back to him, and he was like, whoa, how come it runs so fast? What did you do? I was like, don't worry about it. And he's like, oh, cool, I wanna dig around in the code and change it. I'm like, don't, please don't, trust me. Don't mess with my code. So anyway, that was kind of a fun anecdote. So while I kind of had to program Ada, I still found a way to incorporate assembly language and honing my assembly coding skills, which were required to program video games. So I worked at that outfit for about 2 years or so. That was a lot of fun. And the next job was actually my very first video game coding job. But I'm gonna leave episode 1 of the show with this. That next episode will introduce my professional game coding career. Aside from having written demos and little, I wouldn't really call them games. I would call them, was curious how to animate a sprite, for example. So I did like a little demo with a sprite or whatnot, but they weren't full games. So my very first game that I coded will be introduced next episode, and it will be Double Dragon for the Atari Lynx. So I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, give me a like button or hit subscribe. I know this is like a YouTube thing that people do, I guess. I've seen it a lot on YouTube, so I'm gonna do it too. Subscribe, like, or don't like if you hate it. But yeah, this was a lot of fun. It's a little rough around the edges. Forgive me, it's my very first episode. Next week's episode hopefully will be better, and enjoy.